The ledger smelled like old guilt. Alessia had learned to recognize it, that particular rot beneath the vellum, beneath decades of careful ink and careful lies. She pressed her fingertip to a water-stained entry from 1987 and felt the raised ghost of numbers that had once meant something holy before men, like the Morellis decided. Holiness was a resource to be liquidated. She didn't hear him come in. She never did. Dante Morelli moved through his own house like a rumor, present only when he decided to be, absent the moment you needed proof. But tonight, she felt him before she saw him. A shift in the library's air, something metallic and alive threading through the smell of old paper. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the lamplight, with his jacket still on and his right hand hanging slightly wrong at his side. A dark stain had soaked through his cuff and dried to the color of rust. No one asked questions in Morelli House. That was the covenant. You kept your eyes level and your curiosity buried, and you were grateful for both the salary and the continued function of your kneecaps. Alessia crossed the room and took his hand. She didn't ask. She simply lifted it toward the light, turned it over, and began unwrapping the makeshift binding he'd wound around his palm, tight enough to be punishment, too rough to be care. She felt him go absolutely still in the way that men like him went still. Not relaxed, but suspended. A held breath wearing a suit. She cleaned it. She wrapped it properly. She worked in silence because the silence was already full and adding words to it felt like interruption. When she finished, she didn't let go immediately. That was her first mistake. Or maybe it was his, that he let her keep it. She asked him 3 months too late, and approximately 1 honest conversation too early. What am I to you? The library felt smaller suddenly. The lamp threw shadows that had no business being that dark. Dante looked at her the way he looked at problems he had already decided to outlast. Something moved behind his eyes, fast, furtive, the way a light goes out in a window when you're standing in the street below. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was worse than coldness. It was a decision. A responsibility, he said. One I take seriously. She waited. Because she knew him well enough by now to know when he wasn't finished destroying something. I never loved you. 5 words, quiet as a door closing. She nodded once, a small, precise movement, the kind you make when you are concentrating very hard on not becoming something smaller than you were. She turned back to the ledger and aligned the edge of a page she had no intention of repairing tonight. She heard him leave. She was gone within the hour. No screaming. She had too much pride for screaming and too much grief for dignity. The two canceled each other into silence. She took her father's restoration tools in their canvas roll, the sealed envelope she had never let out of her sight, and the last few pieces of herself that were still intact enough to carry. The gate closed behind her at 1:17 a.m. Dante stood at the library window and watched the dark swallow her whole. He told himself 1 night would be enough. That distance would do what will had failed to. By the time her taillights disappeared, he had already made the story's only irreversible mistake. He had let her learn her own worth inside his house, and then handed her the door. The apartment remembered her. That was the cruelest part. It held the shape of her old life with perfect fidelity, the slight drag of the warped bottom drawer, the particular silence of 3 a.m. When the cathedral bells had finished and the city hadn't yet decided to be mourning, her restoration tools were on the table before she had consciously put them there. Muscle memory. The body's terrible optimism. It should have felt like return. It felt like a room waiting for something to go wrong. She had been awake 4 hours when Paolo Vescari knocked. She knew it was him before the door opened, because no one else knocked like inconvenience was a talent. He was carrying a paper bag of sfogliatelle and wearing the specific expression of a man who found catastrophe moderately entertaining. "You left," he said. He noticed. "Good morning, Paolo." The city noticed faster. He stepped inside, without waiting, set the bag down, and looked at her apartment the way men from Dante's world looked at anything modest, not with contempt, but with a kind of puzzled respect, like encountering a language they hadn't expected to be fluent in. There are people asking questions about your father, not new questions, old ones, with new urgency. Alessia set down her coffee. What kind of questions? The kind men ask when they believe a dead man hid something they were owed. Dr. Mia Ferraro arrived 40 minutes later. She read Alessia's face before reading the room, efficient, clinical, almost gentle, in the way of people who have learned that gentleness is simply faster. She sat across from Alessia at the small table and folded her hands. You look like someone who slept 2 hours and is planning to pretend otherwise. I'm fine. Everyone in that house says that. It means nothing. Then Dante came. No knock. The door simply opened, and he filled it, coat still on, jaw set, carrying the cold of the outside like a second presence. He looked at her the way he always did when he was deciding how much truth to release, measuring, controlled, and just barely containing whatever was larger underneath. Your father, he said, was involved in something before he died. Documents, proof of internal movement that certain people cannot allow to surface. You are the connection they believe leads to it. And you knew this. I knew enough. Those 3 words landed like a flat stone on still water. Alessia watched the rings move outward. Leave, she said. He didn't argue. Dante Morelli had the particular intelligence of a man who understood when a battle would cost more than the ground it gained. He left 2 men in the hall, nameless and immovable as architecture. She stood at her window after he was gone and looked at the cathedral below. St. Agnes, stripped of gold by centuries of weather, remained standing anyway. Her father had loved this view. He had stood exactly here, she realized, knowing something he couldn't tell her, carrying weight she hadn't known to share. The city spread below in morning gray, beautiful and indifferent, and full of men already moving toward her. Dante's shadow had reached her apartment before his apology. She understood now that the apology was never coming. What was coming instead was the truth she'd been protected from, arriving ugly and armed and entirely unwilling to wait for her to be ready. She pulled the curtain. She opened her tools. She got to work because restoration had always been the only prayer she trusted. And if her father had left her answers, he would have left them in paper. He would have left them the only way a bookman knew how, hidden inside something nearly ruined, waiting for hands, careful enough to find them. Her father hid truth the way he hid grief inside things that looked broken beyond saving. The prayer book had been with her for months, wrapped in linen at the bottom of the tool case, too damaged to rush and too important to ignore. Water damage along the spine, smoke blackening the lower boards. She had catalogued the wounds without examining the architecture beneath them, the way a person can look at a scar for years without asking what made it. She made herself ask now. Under magnification, the spine's inner structure told a different story than the outer damage. The boards had been reglued recently, carefully, by someone who knew the craft. She knew her father's work the way she knew his handwriting, the particular angle of his bone folder, the specific tension of his linen thread. Someone had opened this book apart and closed it again. That someone was him. The hidden compartment was empty. Not destroyed, emptied. The recess was the length of a document, rolled or folded to a very particular dimension. Whatever it had held, he had moved it before he died, or someone had taken it after. She was still cataloging the void when Dante came through the studio door. The way he looked at the prayer book told her everything she needed to know about what he already knew. You're aware of what was inside it, she said. Not a question. I'm aware of what your father was trying to preserve. And you put me in your house and said nothing. I put you in my house to keep you alive. He held her gaze without flinching, which was somehow worse than deflection. There's a distinction. The distinction, Alessia said quietly, is why I left. They stood across the workbench from each other, the damaged book between them, every revealed seam an indictment, and she watched him absorb the reality of what she'd uncovered. She had gone further in 2 hours than he'd anticipated. She could see him recalibrating, something shifting behind his eyes that looked uncomfortably close to respect. That was when the window shattered. The first shot came through the glass and hit the shelf above her head. Dante was moving before the sound finished, grabbing her arm and throwing the work table onto its side between them and the street with a violence that suggested he had done this before. He returned fire through the lower window with terrifying precision, controlled, angled, costing him nothing in composure. Alessia pressed against the upturned table and focused on her breathing. The smell of the studio glue, varnish, old paper mixed with gunpowder until she couldn't separate the life she'd built from the one bleeding into it. It was over in 90 seconds. The silence after gunfire is its own specific register, thicker than ordinary quiet, full of unprocessed sound. Dante turned to check her before the echo finished. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her for one moment longer than necessary. Then he looked at the book still on the floor, splayed open, pages catching the light coming through the broken window. "We're leaving," he said. She picked the prayer book up first. He watched her tuck it under her arm and say nothing, do nothing, just hold it as though it were still salvageable. And perhaps because he understood that she was right, or because the attack had proven something he'd rather argue around, he simply opened the door and moved them through it. She had not obeyed him. Bullets had answered for her. The distinction, she thought, mattered enormously. The chapel smelled like extinguished candles and old decision. It sat at the far edge of the estate's grounds, small enough to be private, cold enough to be honest. The kind of space built not for celebration, but for the confessions that couldn't be made in rooms where other people could hear the weight of them. The saints along the walls were worn smooth at the hands and feet from decades of other people's emergencies. Alessia set the prayer book on the altar rail and turned to find Dante watching the flame of the single candle he'd lit with the expression of a man who had brought the same grief to this particular fire before. She asked without planning to, "How long have you been coming here?" "Since I was 12. He didn't look away from the flame. "It's the only room in this estate that nobody comes to fix." She understood that in the way she understood damaged things, completely and in the marrow. He told her about her father in this room not warmly, but honestly, which was the currency she valued more. Her father had come to him weeks before he died, with evidence of movement inside Morelli operations. Money, roots, names. He had trusted Dante with the knowledge, and Dante with his daughter, in that specific order. He had asked for a name attached to power, and a promise attached to protection. "He asked you to marry me," Alessia said. "He asked me to put my name between yours and the men hunting him. Marriage was the only form of protection they would fear enough to respect." She sat with that for a long moment. The candle moved in the draft. "That isn't the same as caring what happened to me." "No," Dante agreed, "it isn't." She appreciated the refusal to dress it as something gentler. She hated, simultaneously, how much she appreciated it. The fire started in the side vestibule, fast, accelerant-fed, deliberate. Smoke came through the arch before either of them registered the smell as danger. Dante grabbed her by the waist in the same motion as turning toward the door, and they moved through the chapel in a single trajectory of smoke and stumbling saints, and the sound of very old wood, understanding it had reached its last night. Outside, in air cold enough to hurt, they stood in the grass with the chapel burning behind them like a confession that had finally become too large for the room. She turned to look at him. The firelight was doing something complicated to his face. "My mother and sister died in fire," he said. He said it the way people say things they have carried so long the weight has become posture. "I was late. 11 minutes. I have counted them most days since." The chapel collapsed inward with a sound like a held breath finally released. Alessia did not reach for his hand. She stood close enough that their arms touched, and she let the contact be what it was: small, deliberate, and refusing to pretend the air between them was ordinary. He didn't move away. The fire burned, the cold pressed in, and somewhere in the 11 minutes he carried like a second skeleton, she found the shape of everything he had never let her close enough to know. Truth has texture. Her father knew that better than anyone. By morning, the heat damage to the prayer book's lower boards had done what no tool could replicate it, had loosened the final hidden layer of the inner back panel, the place where a bookman hid things he needed, found only by another bookman. Under graphite and angled light, impressions emerged, names pressed into vellum with an instrument thin enough to leave, marks the eye couldn't catch without coaxing. Alessia worked for 2 hours before she trusted what she was reading. Payment routes, dates, names, encoded in a system she recognized from her father's private cataloging, shorthand, the same notation he'd used for provenance questions in archival work, now repurposed for something considerably more dangerous. The entries were meticulous, damning, and running through them like a signature thread was a single name that appeared at the origin point of every transaction. Riccardo Salviati. She knew the name. Dante's oldest ally, a man her father had once described as the kind of dangerous that wore good manners the way armor wore polish. She told Dante about the vellum strip. She had not planned the timing. She had not planned most of the truest things she'd done since Dante came back into her orbit. She unrolled it on the table between them, under the lamp, and watched his face as he read. The process of watching Dante absorb evidence was like watching weather arrive. First, the stillness, then the particular quality of attention that preceded something serious. "Your father gave you this," he said, "before he died. I didn't understand what it meant. You kept it from me. I didn't trust you with it yet." She met his eyes without apology. "Do you want to argue about that? Or do you want to understand what it says?" He looked at the strip for a long moment. Then, "Both, but not right now." They decoded it together, her father's shorthand, Dante's operational knowledge filling the gaps, the routes mapped onto known infrastructure. The payments corresponded to incidents that Dante had attributed to external enemies for 2 years. And at the end of the longest entry, half obscured by age and fold damage, was a notation that made the air leave the room entirely. "The fire that killed his mother and sister, logged as an arranged outcome, commissioned." Dante went very still, the kind of still that has nothing to do with calm. Alessia watched him carry the knowledge from his eyes into the rest of his body, the way certain revelations move, not fast, but total, rearranging everything they pass through. She had expected fury. What she saw was worse, the specific expression of a man whose grief had just been handed a direction. "Salviati was in this house last week," Dante said. "I know. He sat at my table. I know." Somewhere inside the compound, a door closed too quickly and footsteps moved in the wrong direction. Dante heard it before she did. The look he gave her across the table was brief and entirely clear. They had just named the enemy. The enemy already knew it. The war had a face now. And somewhere in the house, someone had already sent word. The city at night belongs to people with nothing left to lose. They moved through it in convoy, 3 cars, rotating intervals, routes that existed nowhere digitally. Alessia had learned to read the quality of Dante's silence by its weight. This one was operational, pressed flat against his jaw, the kind that meant he was counting exits and running threat geometry instead of thinking about her. She did not find this comforting. She found it, despite everything, clarifying. The ambush came in the underpass on the river's east bank, sodium light, wet concrete, the particular acoustics of enclosed violence that makes everything sound closer and more final than it is. The lead car went sideways across 2 lanes, Doors opened and closed like a sentence being punctuated at gunpoint. Dante said her name once sharp, specific, and she moved exactly where he pointed, because there was no world in which not moving was the better option. She had held a weapon twice in her life before tonight. The third time was in a parking structure, with gunfire reflecting off the ceiling and a man advancing toward her from the wrong angle. She fired. She did not think about what she felt. She thought about geometry. Dante was already outside the car, and she understood viscerally why the city feared him. He moved through chaos like it was terrain he had surveyed in advance. No wasted motion, no visible fear. The cold efficiency of a man who had made peace with violence the way others make peace with mathematics. It was not beautiful. It was something worse and more truthful than beautiful. He took a blade in the side between engagements. She saw it from across the underpass, the stagger, the recovery, the way he continued, as though the body had simply filed a complaint he would address later. When it was over, the underpass was quiet in the way that only follows irreversible things. At the safe flat third floor, blackout curtains, the smell of industrial cleaning fluid, and other people's former emergencies, she sat across from him and changed his bandage with the same hands that had cleaned his wound in the library. The parallel was not lost on either of them. It sat in the room between them like a question neither had agreed to answer yet. "The first time," he said. She looked up. His face was difficult. "In the library. You took my hand without asking what I'd done with it." "Yes, no one does that." "I know." He looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back, and neither of them performed anything. The intimacy of the moment was assembled entirely from subtraction. No armor, no strategy, no self-protection. Just two people in a room, with the truth of what they were to each other arriving ahead of any permission. The kiss was brief, almost restrained. It carried the weight of everything neither of them had said in any of the rooms that had led here: the library, the chapel, the underpass, the long months of nearness without truth. Then his phone broke the silence open, and war came back in through the door before either of them could pretend it changed nothing. It had. It had changed everything. The train ticket was real. The fellowship was real. The life it represented had simply been waiting, intact and uncomplicated, in a city that didn't know her name. Rome. Study. Restoration work on collections that had never been touched by men with guns. A future assembled entirely from things she had chosen before Dante existed in her world as anything except a name attached to a family, attached to danger. Matteo drove her to the station without asking questions. He had the particular loyalty of someone who had never been given reason to offer it, willingly competent, exact, and wearing his allegiance the way a coat hangs on a man not built for its cut. She noticed, in retrospect. She hadn't known to look then. The platform was ordinary in the way that places of enormous consequence always disappoint concrete. Departure boards, the smell of espresso and diesel, and the ordinary lives of people moving between cities for ordinary reasons. She stood with her passport in her coat pocket and the ticket in her hand, and felt the future arrange itself ahead of her with terrible clarity. Matteo appeared at her shoulder. "This world eats women who wait for dangerous men to become gentler than they were built," he said, not unkindly, with the specific resignation of someone delivering a truth they wished were otherwise. She knew he wasn't wrong. She knew, also, standing there, with every exit available and every reason aligned, that she had already decided before the platform. That the decision had been made somewhere in the underpass, or in the chapel, or the night she stood at the library window and watched the dark take her and realized the dark had not, in fact, taken everything. She had gone all the way to the station to confirm it. She tore the ticket in half over the trash bin. The halves fell separately, two pieces of a future that had been real until 30 seconds ago. Dante was in the operations room when she arrived, maps on the table, men around the edges, the specific atmosphere of a room running on insufficient sleep and too much consequence. He looked up when she came through the door, and something moved in his face that he didn't immediately reassemble. "I came back," she said. The room understood it before he responded. She watched it register across every person present, the shift in weight, the recalibration of what she was in this architecture. Not protected, not peripheral. Present, deliberate, choosing the cost with open eyes. Dante held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "I know," he said, and in the way he said it, not with relief, not with triumph, but with the careful weight of a man receiving something he understands he does not deserve. She recognized the first honest thing he had ever given her freely. She pulled up a chair. She sat down at the table. She had come home to the only house that had ever told her the truth, even when the truth was terrible. Trust is the only wound that requires your own hands to make it. Alessia had earned movement inside the new operations center by the simple economics of necessity. She knew the book, the notation, the provenance, and the particular shorthand of a dead man who had trusted her more than he'd trusted any of them. That knowledge gave her access. Access, she had not yet learned, was only worth what the person walking beside you believed it was worth. The records room was on the 3rd floor. The service elevator, under Matteo's key, opened on the basement. She understood at the level of the body, before the mind caught up the too long descent, the particular quality of Matteo's stillness, the way he did not meet her eyes in the reflection of the metal door. The basement smelled of old, cold, and water, and the specific kind of darkness that has never been asked to be anything else. Matteo. He looked at her then. She had expected calculation. What she saw was devastation. "He has my daughter," Matteo said. 8 weeks. I had no A. His voice stopped working. He restarted it. There was no other way he would give her back. She thought of 100 responses. She said none of them, because Matteo was both a man who had lost his moral architecture under unbearable pressure and the person who had just delivered her into the hands of someone who wanted her dead, and both of those things were simultaneously true, and neither canceled the other. Riccardo Salviati's cold storage room was elegant in the way of men who considered aesthetics a form of dominance. He was already there when the door opened, standing in the light with his coat perfectly placed and the particular composure of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation. He spoke at length. He was the kind of monster who understood himself completely, who had built a philosophy around what he was and could present it with the fluency of a thesis. Love, he told her, was a mechanical weakness. He had not destroyed people through hatred. He had destroyed them through their attachments. Dante's mother and sister, the slow ruin of her father, the methodical dismantling of everything Dante had tried to hold, all of it a proof of concept. Devotion makes men steer slower, he said. I merely used the wheel. The door locked. The cold pressed in. Alessia sat down on the floor and breathed for exactly 60 seconds. Not from defeat, but because panic is a resource expenditure, and she needed to be solvent. She went through her pockets with the precision of a restorer cataloging damage. Hairpin, the particular dry quality of the air suggesting compromised wiring in the east wall. Moisture patterns along the lower baseboard indicating the drainage system's path. Paper fibers from the prayer book, still caught in the lining of her coat. She had been carrying them for days without knowing it. Her father had taught her that the most damaged objects were rarely beyond saving, that the ones people abandoned prematurely were usually the ones with the most intact internal structure. She got to work. Because if Dante was coming, she needed time. And if he wasn't, she would need considerably more than prayer. He did not drive. He moved through the city like it was a problem he intended to solve before it finished asking itself. Alessia had been gone 40 minutes before Dante knew. He knew because the operations room shifted a quality of stillness among the men near the door that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with something that had already been decided without him. He followed that stillness to its source, with the patience of someone who understood that information traveled in the body before it traveled in words. Matteo's absence told him the rest. What followed was not rage in the way that rage is performed. It was colder than that, and more total, the specific focus of a man for whom loss has already taken everything once and is not permitted a second inventory. He moved through the organization, like a wound being examined from the inside, safe houses falling open, loyalty reassorted in real time. The geometry of betrayal traced backward through every room Riccardo Salviati had ever stood in as a trusted man. The cold storage compound was on the river's south side, old infrastructure, deep walls, the kind of location that appeared on no operational map because it predated the maps. Dante's men hit it from 3 points of entry simultaneously, and she heard it from inside the locked room as a change in the building's pressure, the way structures register violence before the sound arrives. She was already through the damaged panel when the door opened. Matteo was in the corridor beyond it, wounded, leaning against the wall with one hand pressed to his side and his face arranged into the specific expression of a man who has nothing left to spend except the truth. He had learned too late that Riccardo had never intended to return his daughter, only to keep inventing reasons to own him. He gave her the route to Dante's position in the building's upper section without being asked. "Tell him," Matteo said, each word arriving separately, "that I was weaker than I should have been." Whatever hope had kept him obedient was gone now. The man who had traded loyalty for a daughter had finally understood there had never been a trade. She kept his eyes until he couldn't keep hers anymore. Then she moved. Riccardo's office was on the second floor, glass and steel, and the cold theatrical lighting of a man who staged his own authority. Dante had him by the throat against the far wall, and the quality of what she saw in Dante's body was the most frightening thing she had witnessed across all the preceding nights. Not violence, but the absolute suspension of everything except the intention to end. Riccardo was speaking, smiling, even, performing his thesis to the last. Alessia said Dante's name, one word, not loud. He turned. The moment he saw her alive, standing in the doorway, with blood that wasn't hers on her sleeve, and her father's tools still under her arm, something happened to his face that Riccardo Salviati had spent years trying to engineer into a weapon, and had, in his fundamental misunderstanding of what love actually is, only succeeded in creating into armor. Dante crossed the room. He touched her face with one hand barely, fingertips at her jaw, the careful contact of a man handling something he'd been terrified had already broken. She held still and let him look. Then she stepped back. "The evidence is intact," she said. "All of it." He finished it with control. That difference between what he could have become in that room and what he chose to be was the whole distance between Riccardo's world and hers. Riccardo had built his philosophy on the premise that devotion was a liability. He died, having failed to account for the one variable his model could not absorb, that it can also make a man patient enough to choose. The city was scarred by mourning. The canal road still smelled of smoke. In the operations room, stripped down to its essential people, Dante stood at the window with his back to her, and the silence between them no longer hostile, just large, and in need of honest furnishing. She sat at the table. She set the prayer book down. She had come back to him. He had burned the city to find her. And somewhere in the ruins of everything Riccardo Salviati had been so certain he understood, the truth he had once cut her open to avoid stood waiting, patient, intact, refusing to be restored by anyone except him. He let her go for one night. It had nearly taken everything. He turned from the window. She looked up. That was enough. For now, to begin.